شكرا جزيلا على هذه الجلسة المثرية. لكن يبقى السؤال، هل يجي يوم يجينا الدوام بدل ما نروح له؟ أتمنى أنه نلقى له إجابة. اليوم ما عندنا إلا على طول داخلين في الحامي، جلسة ورا جلسة، حندخل في جلسة على طول. لكن نذكركم قبل لا نبدأ في الجلسة، لأن في ناس جديدة، إن في تطبيق خاص بالإيفنت عرب نت رياض 2016. اللي ما حمله ممكن يعطينا فرصة للتواصل أكبر مع بعض. أيضا التصويت إن شاء الله راح ينتهي اليوم الساعة 2 الظهر. لا زال عندنا فرصة إننا نصوت للفكرة اللي نرشحها أو المشروع اللي شفناه أمس. أيضا عندنا مسارات جديدة اليوم، فتحت مسارات جديدة للميديا والاستثمار للمهتمين، أيضا ممكن تحصلوها في المحيط. الجلسة التالية راح تكون من ماكنزي، راح يتكلموا عن الشرق الأوسط الرقمي وعن تحول المنطقة للرقمية والريادة. راح يكون معنا السيد جيفار باتل شريك في ماكنزي ديجيتال، وأيضا السيد يان مور كشريك مساعد في ماكنزي ديجيتال. ماكنزي, welcome on the stage.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having us. Today we're going to talk to you about some research Jan and I and a few of our colleagues have been doing about the state of digital in the Middle East. Before we get into some of the technicalities of the research, let me set up, some of the reasons why we were doing this and what some of the higher level outcomes are. So today, actually, we live in very exciting times. I think the panelists this morning were talking about some of the exciting things that are happening right down at the grassroots level of people who are excited by technology, who are excited by digital, excited by engineering, coming up with innovative new things in our region here, and us being able to then export these more globally. And I think the VC scene, the accelerator scene here is getting much more organized. If you think about the different technology cycles that have been happening over the last, let's say, 30, 40 years, with each new mega cycle of technology, the time between these cycles is getting shorter and shorter. The waves of innovation, right, from business software to internet and e-commerce, from internet and e-commerce to mobile broadband, these waves are coming much, much quicker. And I think as we fast forward from the time that we are now into the next 5 and 10 years, we'll see innovation at an astonishing rate. So, like I said, it's a very exciting time to be here in the region. It's a very exciting time for people that are wanting to innovate and be part of the digital transformation. And in the Middle East, we are actually at the heart of this transformation. If you think about the last 10 years, from 2005 to 2015, the data traffic that is coming into and out of the Middle East has grown by 150 times over. It's an astonishing amount. We are more connected now in the Middle East than we've ever been to the rest of the world. If you think about the people in the room today here, or even the people outside on the street, in Saudi Arabia, 9 out of 10 people are walking around with a supercomputer in their pocket. The smartphone and phone penetration levels in Saudi Arabia and in places like the UAE in the Middle East is astonishingly high. Our consumers and our everyday people are ready to consume technology, and they're very tech savvy. If you then think about some of the other mega trends that are going to disrupt us in the next few years, by 2020, which is not that far away, there will be 2 zettabytes of data. So when we first started doing this research, I had to figure out what a zettabyte was. A zettabyte is basically a number followed by 21 zeros. It's a huge, to put that number into perspective, because I don't understand it when somebody says zettabyte, that's more than the grains of sand covering the Arabian desert. Right? That's how many more bytes of data will be generated in the next 5 years here in the Middle East. And it's not just these technology trends and data trends, right? The way in which companies are thinking about some of this stuff is also changing. We heard about some of the things like wrap-up, right? It would be amazing. I spent my entire life in meetings. I just made a note of that startup to figure out how much their product costs, because it would be great to have my meeting digitized and then all the participants getting their agenda, their takeaways, and their action points. And that's at the bottom of the stack, right? Startups that are doing these exciting things. But corporations, well-established corporations, are also participating in the gains from digitizing the way that they work, digitizing their interfaces to the customer, or digitizing everyday user journeys that happen. So, of course, I won't need to say a lot about Kareem. People probably already know. This will be the next unicorn that comes out of the region. If you look at, for example, in the UAE, some of the petrol companies are innovating with RFID tags to change the consumer experience of paying at the petrol station. You don't have to exchange any money or credit cards or get out. You can simply just drive through. If you look at some of the banks, this robot example behind me is from a bank in Lebanon. They're experimenting with changing the customer interface from a human-to-human interaction in a branch to a human-to-robot interaction to create a standardized, high-quality experience for the consumer. So all in all, again, exciting times and lots of examples of trends that are going to really grow and contribute to the economy.
And I think when we looked at some of these exciting facts and anecdotes that honestly I think in this room probably excite everybody about the opportunities ahead, it's also important not to forget that there are also some real challenges still to overcome. So while we've been talking about the smartphone adoption in Saudi, if you look at the region as a whole, 158 million people in the region that we looked at, there's still a huge digital divide. So I found it very interesting when a colleague from 500 Startups said, almost any new business in this region has almost an inherent double bottom line. And there are challenges to figure out that might be more pertinent in this region and where also this region can come up with new solutions that are applicable elsewhere in other countries and regions that also struggle with this divide. Moreover, if you look further, there's also on some of the ecosystem enablers still a gap, right? While we just had two representatives of the VC funding on stage, if you compare it and put it into perspective, there's still a 20x difference in terms of VC funding available per nominal GDP in the region compared to where the United States is. So it's also not obvious why the next big unicorn can come from here if some of the funding availability, the transparency is not a given. And where this leads is exactly what we see, right? Everybody knows there's Souk.com. I think they will be later here on stage, and it's an exciting story about building up a real regional brand, maybe a little bit of copy cloning involved, but then also building a real regional ecosystem with lots of small businesses benefiting around them. I think this is also critical to remember. The unicorn effect is not just about having these unicorns. It's more about their lighthouse effect on the environment around them. And then when we kind of looked at this, we said now is the time to look beyond just the anecdotes and put a little bit structure and analysis to this domain. So similar, based on efforts that we've done in the US and Europe before, we've basically gathered data across 24 variables, 4 dimensions and 30 countries to basically build up a digitization index that gives us a snapshot of where is the economy today and how does it compare to other regions and other countries around the globe. Now, we've done this analysis for 9 Middle Eastern countries. You see them here on the chart. And then we've also included some benchmark countries, regions, not just the United States and Europe, but also some countries in Asia Pacific that in terms of their stage of maturity and development might be at a similar stage. The 4 dimensions that I mentioned basically cover, on the one hand side, the demand side, so the more consumer B2C digitization plays, which might, as we just heard, already be in a more mature state than some of the other areas. Then there's the business domain, so more the B2B areas of digitization. There's a government element to it. And lastly, it's important to recognize also you can be as digitized as you want to be, but that does not necessarily mean that you also kind of have the local supply and talent, and these solutions are actually locally created. You might just import them in the same way as you import other goods and services. So when we look at this, basically a heat map emerges of where are the different countries, how do they compare. In the published report, which by the way is available free for download on our website, there are some more analysis around these. Today I just would highlight kind of 4 insights. So first of all, a key insight is that on the consumer side, some countries in the Middle East are actually right up at the digital frontier. So they even exceed in their adoption of digital countries like the US or regions like Europe. The second element is, if you look at the business side, the picture becomes much more varied. Yeah? So while the consumer side, the consumers are leading, and especially in a country like Saudi Arabia, I think everybody experiences and sees that on a daily basis, we actually see a real opportunity for businesses to kind of apply this also to themselves and pushing the B2B opportunities. And then on the government side, I think everybody is aware of, and I've also seen in the conference publication, there's quite a bit of documentation of the different government programs and a lot of ambitions and new fundings, new programs that basically have been discussed and now initiated. But if you look at the facts at the moment, it's still lagging behind. There's a lot of implementation work still to be done in order to capture really the opportunities and the benefits from these ambitions. The last one, and that's really, I would say, the most important and critical one is, while you actually see that on the consumer side, the region is quite up there and making progress towards the digital frontier, the ICT supply and innovation ecosystem is lagging behind, which means the region is still more of an importer of digital products and services than actually a creator or innovator. So when we take this together, I think the big message that we take out is, or the question for the region is, how to move from being this leading digital consumer to being a digital innovator. We put the numbers together, just two more slides. One thing, if you combine all these indices and put numbers around it, the analysis shows that the Middle East currently captures only 8.4% of its digital potential. The digital potential here is determined basically by the US technology sector as a benchmark, and then using all the indices that I presented earlier to come up with a combined score. And as you see, there are differences and quite large differences by country in the region. Maybe not surprisingly, some of the smaller kind of city-states in terms of population, they found it easier to move ahead on this digitization than some of the more populous countries like Saudi Arabia, the larger economies. But there's still a lot of opportunity out there. And if you then turn that into economic terms, the numbers actually show that, again, the Middle East as a region captures only about 4.1% of the GDP contribution in terms of digital. And there's a lot of opportunity to kind of move ahead and expand the digital economy. So, as I was saying, I think the upshot of that is there is a real opportunity. If you take all this together, putting a number at it, we believe it amounts to 95 billion GDP contribution that can be captured by expanding the digital economy and just catching up to where other countries are today. To give you an idea, that's a 3.8% uptick in GDP by 2020 if you take the current baseline. So the question now is really, how do we move from the left-hand side of being avid digital consumers in the region to actually becoming digital creators and having not just the one next unicorn, but multiple new unicorns created in the region here?
As part of the research, we also then investigated what are some of the barriers, what are some of the challenges. And if we want to achieve that 95 billion or the 3% uptick in GDP for the Middle East region, there are 4 factors that actually need to be looked at and need to be tackled. And there are 4 different elements to this. So the first one is there is a role that the government and the public state enterprises and public state organizations will have to play. There is a role that the commerce, the business sector, and the large businesses will have to play. There is clearly, as you saw earlier, just before our slot, a role that funding and the availability of finance has to play. And finally, as Jan has mentioned a couple of times, there's a role about talent availability and the talent pipelines required to actually deliver something like this. And across these 4 dimensions, we have a series of different recommendations. I think you can read them behind me, and also, in the interest of time, you can read all of those in more details with some examples from our report that you can find online. We wanted to go through 2 or 3 of them in particular because those would be more relevant, I think, and they're the ones that at least we should start with as quickly as possible. There's one around the fact that if you look at all of the states in the Middle East, most of them have a very aspiring vision to drive digitization, both of the public sector and also of the nation in itself. But when you look at the execution speed and the return of impact of the execution of these visions, that's where you find a lot of variance. Some of the city-states, as Jan said, have managed to drive ahead in this. Some of the larger economies are still more at the vision stage, more at the planning stage, and now will be moving into execution. But what about if you look at countries like Singapore, where they have a very powerful national digital agency, or even countries like Korea or the US, where these national digital agencies have the mandate and have the clear access to the heads of state to make decisions and to accelerate their conversion of their digital vision into the reality on the ground. The second one is some of the regulatory change that we will need to go through. One example is if there are certain regulatory changes and policies that are established, if there's more cooperation across some of the borders in relation to at least financial regulation, why would we not be able to basically develop an integrated payment platform for the entire Arab world? Today, in some of the larger economies, this is a very fragmented space. It's very much driven by the hard regulation. It's very much driven by the regulator themselves. But if we get this right, there are 65 billion transactions, financial transactions that are happening in the Arab world every year. Capturing that and retaining some of the value here in the Middle East could be a 2 billion contribution to the economy.
And then I think I will not talk at large about that. I think that was very much the topic also from the previous session. In terms of how to close this gap in terms of VC funding, I think one important element in order to attract more investment and capital is also to create more transparency about the investment opportunities. So I'm always amazed about how many startups are actually active and opening up in the region every day, and how much creative energy and young talent there is. But I think if you think about the traditional investors, a colleague earlier mentioned a lot of the current investment in the region still flows into asset classes like real estate, etc. And the risk profile around that, the transparency about how to invest into new technology and startups in the right way is still lagging. And on the talent side, I think one big element is also to recognize nurturing this type of talent requires a very different education system and education to employment system than what has traditionally been kind of happening, especially in the region. So creating more seamless learning across the different education segments, digitizing the process itself, but thereby also making it more accessible to also overcome and identify talent that might not live in the major hubs like Riyadh or Jeddah, but is kind of more spread out in the country, I think is an important imperative to really capture this opportunity and lift all boats in the digital economy.
So I think that's where we will end the session today. We wanted to end with this quote because you know, the best time to plant a tree is actually 20 years ago. But the second best time is right now. And I think this very much sums up the fact that despite whatever the recent history of our ability to drive digital in the region, our excitement to drive digital in the region, the successes and the failures, when it comes to technology and when it comes to digital, I think, you know, the best time is right now. And I think if you go through our report and some of the recommendations, you'll see that pretty much everyone in this room will have a part to play in helping us get there together. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
إذا ماكنزي تقول أن الشرق الأوسط يستطيع الانتقال من الاستخدام والاستهلاك إلى الصناعة، ليس بعد 20 عام إنما اليوم.